World Championship. We are not expecting massive results this year. We have a lot to learn about F1. It's a very straightforward car, but we have a few tricks up our sleeves. Sam, winning the championship within 4 years of starting up. Let's forget Lola for a moment. Should any team, even more than 2 decades ago, have been talking like that when they're first coming in?
No, it sounds ridiculous now, and even then it was just it's quite deluded in a way. Adrian Reynard was rightly sort of derided and castigated for saying something similar just a couple of years later, and the only reason I think Eric probably got away with it to some extent was that he had a massive amount of respect from people in Formula One, because let's not forget that a fair few of those, like Patrick Head and John Barnard, who were around in '97, had cut their engineering teeth back in Huntingdon in the early '70s. Those kind of statements ring alarm bells at the best of times, but when we've seen something that in modern Formula One, even now, it took in the last decade, it took Red Bull several years to break through, and indeed when you go back to Williams, it took a decade. Benetton took almost a decade. Ron Dennis took 4 years to win. With McLaren, that was already a very established team with lots of capabilities. It just wasn't realistic to even consider, probably with that package, even winning a Grand Prix in 5 years, 4 or 5 years, let alone challenging for a championship. So with a real budget and the capabilities, a well-stocked winning team could potentially get there or get podiums or challenge for wins, but I think this is the last thing that a project such as this needed. There was no reason for Eric to do this. In fact, quite the opposite. He should have been taking the opposite approach, I think, and being what he was as a person, which was pretty humble, and he's a quiet guy who was a solid old school engineer, which makes me think that there was some reason for him making these pretty stark proclamations. And I just sense, I don't know, but I sense that the MasterCard commercial aspect of it was had some kind of buzzword marketing program that's unfortunately somebody in their late 60s probably wasn't the right person to activate, let's say.
And the questions from the media in attendance at this launch did bring some realism to proceedings, as most of the questions were about if Lola would even be able to qualify within that 107% limit that was brought in for 1996 to stop unprepared teams from getting into the races. Broadly did address that. He said the 107% rule is quite a large margin, in fact, and if we cannot do that, then we really shouldn't be in it. I accept in the first couple of races we could have some silly problems, but apart from that, I have no fears. He also repeatedly brought up Lola's kart and IndyCar efforts quite a bit at the launch. He said the F1 car has a lot of carryover from the American project, but he also said in many ways F1 is simpler than kart because in America they run on street circuits right the way up to super speedways. That means you have to have a broad range of requirements the car has to be able to adapt to with setup changes. They're actually pretty complicated machines. F1 circuits are much more similar to each other. It's the competitiveness of the cars that is honed that little bit more. And he then referred to Lola's US racing output when talking about the tight time frames, saying we can produce cars in 3 months, we do it regularly, so we use the same people and the same machines. Sam, by dismissing the threat of 107% and by making so many comparisons with what Lola was doing in the US, was broadly simply underestimating the technical step up required to go from IndyCar to F1.
Surprisingly, yes, I think he was, and I say surprisingly because he had relatively recent experience of F1 in 1993 with the ill-fated Scuderia Italia partnership, which was wholly uncompetitive. Although, let's face it, did have one of the most 90s ever liveries. You'll never see that sort of garish Eurotrash style Chesterfield cigarettes livery again. Always, it's kind of the F1 equivalent of a shell suit, I always thought. But that apart, I think. F1 was far more technically refined than kart was, although what you call solid engineering, vehicle dynamics, kart was just as relevant, and there are some similarities there. Where things were very different was obviously the aerodynamic factor, and that's where things fell down for Lola, and perhaps personally for Eric. He didn't put significant or sufficient emphasis on aerodynamics as a key performance differentiator, and the stories of him fabricating wishbones and coming up with new suspension geometries in '93, that season that they ran Badoer and Alboreto to try and improve performance of that Lola Ferrari, which was really struggling throughout the most of the season, a Legion. He was physically doing that himself and taking these wishbones and these parts out to Grand Prix and trying to engineer the cars. So it was always done in a kind of affectionate way rather than anything particularly cruel. But I just think Eric, as brilliant as he was just slightly out of time, really, for Formula One at that stage, even in '93. And really, what should have happened is that there should have been a delegation to other really talented engineers. Ben Bowlby had just started at Lola in that time. He was quite a visionary engineer and went on to work in Formula Nippon and Formula 3000. Mark Williams was, I think, around at that time. Some really good engineers who went on to to big projects, and in case of Mark, a lot of good F1 work. So yeah, a delegation issue, but also underestimating completely how far Formula One had gone on from even from the late 80s when they were working with LaRousse.
Broadly also defended Lola's engine plans, from the decision to start with the outdated Ford to the plans for an in-house V10. On the Ford, he said Lola's simulations reckoned it was 80 brake horsepower down on the Renault engine, and he reckoned that was only worth 3/4 of a second per lap. As for Lola's own engine, he said, manufacturing it is obviously no problem for us, and that is one of the reasons we decided to build an engine in the first place. Everybody says that you need 100 million or whatever. I don't believe that is true nowadays. You can make anything with modern machinery and good organisation. We're not going to win in F1 without a super engine, and if we can't get one, we are going to make one. We won't go well enough until we have a good engine, so it's a chicken and egg situation. We really need the new engine as soon as we can. Ed, was he at least talking some sense here about the importance of the engine, or is it impossible to look past the fact that he's just underestimating what it would take to build a competitive engine?
It's curious, there seems to be some cognitive dissonance here. He recognises the strong engines needed, yet simultaneously he's ignoring why what is spent by the manufacturer teams to produce a good engines is being spent. Yeah, you can manufacture things with good organisation and machinery if you can acquire that and set it all up, but you've got to design it, and that requires time and money. Rigorous testing, you're into material science, electronics research, dyno. I mean, the list is absolutely endless. A huge amount of effort, and also this is at a time when we're seeing more and more exotic materials in F1. It was a huge design and development challenge, and this strikes me as someone who only saw the manufacturing angle of it. And ultimately, Eric Broadley, for his many talents, he wasn't an engine builder, was he? So I guess it was quite easy to overlook, as people sometimes do, as we all do. Things look quite easy if you're not directly involved in them, but making an engine is not just about making it, it's all the other work that goes into it. And then you've got all the things like fuel suppliers and fuel, it was just totally unrealistic and underestimating it dramatically.
Now, listeners, you'll be shocked to learn that the next line on my script is the sentence, preparations for Australia didn't go well. At the car's shakedown at the Santa Pod drag strip, it suffered an engine failure, and then at its only proper pre-season test at Silverstone, it suffered gearbox problems, and Suspiri's car even caught fire leaving the pits. This at least seemed to inject some realism into the public declarations from Lola, with team manager Ray Bolter saying, we've got a hell of a lot of work to do, but we've just got to go out there and do the best we can, get on with the job and get some miles in. Everyone's done really well to get this far, and we're just going to keep chipping away. But we're trying to be realistic. We're working towards getting 2 cars in the race and to the end of it, and if we qualify both, we'll be doing well. Suspiri was pretty relaxed about the lack of preparation. He said recently, we didn't get to know the car before Melbourne, but it was okay because I knew the problem. I knew the car was built without being in a wind tunnel, and we were starting from scratch. I didn't think too much about the first year. I just focused on being better in the second year because I had a lot of things to learn. Suspiri and Rosset were also interviewed by GP Update in 2017 about this project, and in that feature, Suspiri said that from the handful of laps he managed at the test, it was clear that it was hard to keep the car going in a straight line because it was shaking, that was the word he used, which he reckoned was because of how unbalanced the aero was. Both drivers have said in separate interviews in recent years that they felt the car was worse than an F3000 car, and just before the Australian Grand Prix, Lola got that data confirmed. The car was certainly designed without going in a wind tunnel before it was built, but just before Australia, Lola finally did some wind tunnel testing. So let's hear from designer Chris Saunders, who was tasked with trying to sort out the aero on this car.
Well, we did finally build a wind tunnel, and it was really late, but we did manage to get it in the wind tunnel, and I think we did 2 days testing before the race, and all we were doing was mapping it really. And then I looked at the first data and I thought, this has got less downforce than the Formula 3000 car, which it did by a lot. So I just did, you can work out power and a few things like that on lap time, do some sims and things. And I thought, maybe it's going to be 9 or 10 seconds a lap off the pace. I think it was 11 or something like that. So I just knew that with the horsepower we had and with the aero that we had, there was just no way I was going to do anything, even qualify.
Sam, there was some great stuff from Chris. You interviewed him for this episode, and it's just brilliant. There's more from him to come. But looking at where we were before the cars were packed off to Australia, if you were cynical about Lola's hopes before the car turned a wheel, by this point, was it already a foregone conclusion that Australia was going to be a disaster?
Absolutely it was. The people within the team were bracing for it, but it was to a large part even a surprise to them just how far away they were from a pace perspective. But what actually from the teams they had achieved to that point was pretty incredible. I mean, getting the two cars to leave the pit lane in that short space of time. Remember, they really didn't start working on it until late November. Was, that shouldn't be forgotten. In an operational sense, it was a miracle that they were in Albert Park. Ray Balter, as we heard from the team manager, worked wonders, and so did Dave Luckett, who is a very well-respected chief mechanic, formerly of Arrows, who worked on the project as well. To give you an idea as to how late everything was, they hadn't practiced a fuel stop because the rig only turned up at Melbourne on the Thursday morning before free practice. The first free practice on the Friday. That's how late everything was. Going back briefly to the Silverstone test, which they shared with Stewart, it became all too apparent that the new teams were just poles apart. And I think, as well as on the personnel side, there were issues too, because Chris Murphy, who, don't forget, had been involved in the LaRousse Lola project in 89 and 90, he was technically in charge of drawing the car, but he actually didn't engineer a car. Eric insisted that he engineered Rosset with a guy called Dave Wynn, who was a South African engineer who worked in touring cars, because Eric knew and liked him because he'd worked with Bridgestone tyres for a couple of seasons. And Sosberry worked with Alex Zoglin, who worked with Collis and I think with Midland in F1 for a few years as well. So all that apart, yes, there was a cloud of doom really over the whole thing as soon as the sessions ended. I mean, it's an old cliche. The stopwatch doesn't lie, does it? I mean, at the end of the day, if you are that far off the pace, you've got a serious amount of work to do, and it was clear to everybody in the team that they had to get on it pretty quickly, just to cease the embarrassment really from what they'd gone through at Albert Park.
I'd imagine by this point they weren't timing it with the stopwatch, they were probably timing it with a calendar. Let's get to Australia though. In first practice, Rosset was 10 seconds off the pace and Suspiri was 14 seconds down. In FP2, Rosset was 8.6 seconds off and Suspiri was 10 seconds adrift. Things were a lot worse though in final practice because the pace at the front improved by 4 seconds. Thank you, Jacques Villeneuve. That's your only mention in this episode, I believe. And Rosset was now 12.8 seconds slower and Suspiri was 15.6 adrift. And they only managed 5 and 8 laps respectively in that session. Suspiri says Lola made huge changes to the cars from Friday to Saturday to fix the problem of the car struggling to stay in a straight line. He said they changed the suspension and the wing angles, which made the diffuser less powerful, but at least kept the car going forwards, going straight. Rosset says they were plagued with so many gearbox problems that they considered changing to a manual gear shift for Saturday, but it wasn't possible. Failure to qualify was obviously inevitable at this point, and Rosset's car got stuck in 4th gear, so he trundled round and ended the session slowest and 12.7 seconds off Villeneuve's phenomenal pole time. Suspiri was slightly quicker, but still 11.6 seconds off pole and nowhere near making the 107% cut. The next car above them in the order was Pedro Diniz in the Arrows, and he was 6.6 seconds off Villeneuve. At the time, Rosset said, "We've got a lack of downforce and too much drag. The biggest problem is that we don't have a basic setup for the car, so we guessed at the settings, and when they were wrong, we panicked." Which probably explains the drastic changes Suspiri mentioned between sessions. So Ed, we've got the DNQ that we were all expecting. Where should we begin with this Australian weekend?
I'm not sure if they tweaked the wing settings a little bit, fiddled with the dampers, and they might have found the 5.3 odd seconds that Suspiri needed to make the grid, perhaps. But no, by this point the die was cast. It wasn't even an undercut car; it was a completely raw car, and this was the living embodiment of the the building blocks that didn't exist in this project. And no matter who you throw into that weekend to engineer cars and drive them, you're going nowhere. You're looking for the performance that isn't in that. You could take a charitable view and say that there was obviously system problems and the gear shift problems reflected that. So there were things they could have troubleshooted and got a little bit more pace out of the car, but it's just too much to find. It just would have hit home at that point how far away they were. They weren't running an F1 car. In fact, as been alluded to, they weren't even running an F3000 car, really. It was that far behind. So, yeah, absolute hiding to nothing. And all credit to Riccardo Rosset for trying to put a brave face on it and say, went quite there on the setup. I think that's a very good bit of PR work from him.
That'll probably be the only time you ever hear the phrase all credit to Riccardo Rosset as well. Now, on leaving Australia, Broadley promised the team would be further on at the second race in Brazil. He added, track testing is what we need, but the schedule is so demanding. Let there be no doubt that we are here for the long run and we relish the challenge of F1. This is actually quite an interesting point, Sam. We know where this story is heading, but after the disaster of Australia, did you immediately think that might be the last we saw of this Lola F1 project, or did you think that they would at least be able to keep plugging away?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. The feeling in the team was it would get markedly better, and indeed they all, bar Eric, travelled out to Interlagos after that test in between. The reality, though, was very different with the business side of things coming down like a pack of credit cards, shall we say. In fact, it soon became apparent that as well as the F1 project being in severe jeopardy, the whole of Lola Cars was also becoming increasingly at risk, which is the sad reality of this pretty wretched period in Lola's history. The weird debenture system, which was based on paying for the project through MasterCard, was crumbling, and the fact that the performance was so far off was actually, if you did a list of things that were critical in this whole project, was probably not at the top. I mean, commercially, this thing was done. I mean, the money was never going to come in. Essentially, the money was being sourced from Lola Cars International and from that side of the business, and that just couldn't exist for any period of time, let alone for a whole Grand Prix season. So it was doomed. It was nipped in the bud. Did I think we'd see it again? It was hard to know, because a lot of this was conducted in smoke-filled boardrooms or whatever in 1997, and nobody knew the scale of the true picture, really. I think it looked great. As I said at the top of the show, all the constituent parts appeared to be there, but a lot of it was smoke and mirrors, and it was inevitable that it was going to be found out sooner rather than later. And I think actually it got nipped in the bud at the right time, and they shut those garage doors in Interlagos.
And as you mentioned there, it often gets forgotten that the Lolas did run again after Australia, with Rosset and Suspiri taking part in a test at Silverstone with several other teams. And as I mentioned earlier, Ed, when you interviewed Rosset about this, he claimed he never drove the car again, but he did. Ralph Schumacher was quickest at that test for Jordan. Rosset was 9.5 seconds off the pace, with Suspiri nearly 12 seconds slower than Ralph. Now, Broadley had seemed to get his expectations in check after Australia, but ahead of Brazil, he was feeling bullish once again, declaring, "I was disappointed that we did not race in Australia, but not entirely surprised. I have no doubt that we will qualify in Brazil and then begin to work our way up the grid. That is going to take time. We need more horsepower." Rosset wasn't quite so optimistic, saying of the test, "We didn't improve the car a lot, but we know what the problems are." Now, as it turns out, Broadley's optimism was incredibly misplaced, because, as Chris Saunders recently told Sam, Broadley had in fact made alterations to the car for the second round of the season that were going to make it even slower. So let's hear what Chris remembers of the activity at Lola post-Australia.
For the next race, there was obviously going to need to be some modifications. And Eric, bless him, he was an engineer, but he was a chassis guy, and really didn't get Eric, which is why he employed me, I guess. But he decided that the problem with the car was suspension, roll sensor, and things like this. So, unbeknown to me, he had drawn up rear suspension for the car. So was it Brazil the next race? And at that point, and shortly before the car race, I think Ford impounded the engines or something, which was quite unfortunate. Because anyway, so the drawings and stuff went to the model shop, which I hadn't seen. And so parts were made, and I'm thinking, Eric has done this new rear suspension. And anyway, they turn up in a box at the wind tunnel, we bolt them on, and they went through the diffuser. The lower wishbone leg had been dropped by about 4 inches to change the roll center. And we put this new rear suspension on, and as I remember, it was £190 worse than the car already had started at, the level it started at, which was about 10% worse. I mean, and in normal terms, sort of 10% would be a year's development, on a race car. So in about 10 minutes, we lost a year's development. And I'm thinking, my God, I know what we're going to do, because obviously it was his toy, he could do what he wanted. But ultimately, it was good, because what happened was they impounded the engines, and we never got to the second race. I was going to run with this new suspension, and it would have probably been 13 seconds a lap slower rather than 11. In Eric's eyes, it was easy to change the rear suspension and cut a hole in the diffuser. It was desperate. I remember it all went down the toilet. I remember as Eric coming in and just put his head in his hands and just went, "It's a disaster, it's a disaster," just kept repeating that. And I was thinking, you silly old fool, but then this guy was, because we had told him this was going to happen. But you don't kick something when they're down, do you? And obviously, it wasn't that it wasn't funded. I mean, it was actually quite well funded, because obviously when you saw the amount of money that was owed when Lola went into administration, there was a lot of money spent on the programme. It would have been a lot more sensible to spend that over 18 months, not over 6 months. And it would have been fine.
Sam, you hinted at this earlier, actually. Was another of Lola's fundamental problems with this project just that Eric never really embraced the dawn of aerodynamics?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was a part of the whole issue, really. Lola never had an on-site wind tunnel or 7-post test rig until the Bahrain era a few years later, which tells you all you need to know, really, in relation to how things worked there. There was an element of the old school, as we touched on earlier, and as Chris Saunders attested, Eric just didn't embrace the aero side of things particularly, or invest in it as he should have done in the early 90s, really, as F1 teams were doing. It was an area that could deliver a massive amount of performance, as we knew, but that there just seemed to be this blind spot in and around Lola, and Eric was the leader, so had to take some responsibility in that. It was something of a paradox in a way, because when you look at the success in karts through the 80s and early 90s, and the multitude of aero packages that had to be done for super speedways and short ovals and road courses as well, there was clearly a certain level of expertise, but that was usually either outsourced or was conducted at Cranfield. So it wasn't an in-house capability, really. I wouldn't say it's the only reason why the 9730 was such a disaster, because ultimately the root of the issue was the simple timing decision from late 96, which was just so flawed. That then created a knock-on effect which ultimately doomed the project and ushered in a new era for Lola. I mean, one of the great ironies, of course, is that just a few months later, when Martin Bahrain became the custodian of the constructor of Lola, that one of the first things he did was invest in a technical centre encompassing a wind tunnel. So some irony in that, but that's the way it happened, and it was all part of the modernisation of the brand.
And of course, as we've hinted at a few times, cars never ran in Brazil. They were there, they were in the garages, but Broadley made a decision on the Tuesday night before the race to cut his losses on the failing project and withdraw the team. The Lola spokesman at the time told the media the problems faced by the team were both technical and financial. The MasterCard deal was in the spotlight, with Lola saying, "Our deal with MasterCard meant the revenue would be generated from its new F1 club. But this is not good for us. The balance of finance as it stood was not favourable. It was a timetable situation. We needed the money up front because that is where the investment is needed. We tried to get alternative funds arranged, including additional sponsors, but we were late in starting this programme and we were late in getting the cars ready." MasterCard was quick to distance itself from the failure, releasing a statement that said, "The Lola Formula One organisation is experiencing financial difficulties. As a result of that, Lola Formula One would not be able to continue its 1997 racing season, and as a consequence of that, MasterCard's sponsorship has ended." Nobody told the drivers what was going on, and they only found out when they arrived at the circuit and saw all the garages were locked up. But Ed, ultimately, for all of the mistakes that were made along the way by Lola, was Broadley's decision to throw in the towel when he did the right thing to do?
Yes, absolutely, because continuing it was just putting the whole of the company into ever further jeopardy. And it was clear that they were struggling to make payments. There comes a point where your credit runs out or your cash flow reserves run out. So, of course, they had to stop it. The simple fact was they embarked on this course of rushing it that could have worked if they could have just brute force spent their way through it and survived and got to a couple of years down the line. You could recover from this start, but that was never on the cards. They never had the sustainable income to be able to do that. And it's quite strange to see